Discuss how the tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia could impact American diplomatic efforts in the region. Let's bring in Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Atlantic magazine. One of the questions here, Steve, is this sheikh and who he is and how important he was, at least to peace or lack thereof between these two countries. What do you know?
Well, I think in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, you had both an area there and in Bahrain that began to rise up and to demand for more, essentially, justice from the Saudi regime, and in Bahrain from their Sunni-dominated regime. Bahrain is a Shiite majority country. And in that Arab Spring moment, when we saw protests throughout the region, Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr really called for a more robust movement, and he was arrested shortly after that as part of the protests that were going on. Most look at him as being the voice of that opposition that was calling for greater sectarian justice inside Saudi Arabia. And so it's a confusing picture. Those that are on the side of the Saudi regime look at him as someone who was, brewing rebellion. Those that are human rights activists say he was calling for greater democracy and greater fairness within that system. The importance of this is it pours fuel on a fire that was already raging between Saudi Arabia and Iran throughout the Middle East.
So the question might be here, Steve, based on what we have seen just within the last 24 hours and the execution here of the sheikh, his followers, his supporters, and what might happen after that.
Well, I think that what happens now is everything gets worse, to be honest. When you look at the fact that the Iraqi army just took back Ramadi from ISIS within Iraq, but that depended upon activities of Shia militia coming in and basically knocking off supply routes. That sort of coordination inside places Iraq is going to crumble. In Geneva, we have coming up a peace process at the end of January that will try to begin looking at Syria, and you've got the Saudis and the Iranians both at the table, and John Kerry looked at that as an accomplishment. That is now going to be fraught with new problems.
Okay, so to support different sides of this argument, how might this exacerbate the tensions right now? What's the worst case scenario that you are watching?
Well, I think, one of the things you worry about, which the Iranians have not done other than the embassy, is whether or not you'll begin to see greater armed tension between the Saudis and the Iranians. They're right next to each other across different sides of straits. So that could be an increasing complexity. But I think the bigger challenge is you have proxy wars brewing between Shiite and Sunni interests throughout the Middle East. I expect all of those to intensify. And so while you may not have the direct collisions between Iran and Saudi Arabia, it won't matter, because you're going to see manifestations of the tension everywhere else. And in many of these other places, you have the French, the British, and the Americans trying to tamper down some of these tensions. And you're going to see it all get worse in these various places, particularly in Syria.
Yeah, speaking of which here, you talked about the tensions here, and you've been watching this between Iran and the United States this week. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani sped up development of Iran's missile program. That was in response to the U.S. preparing new sanctions against Iran for recent missile launches. Put this all together in terms of U.S. involvement and what has happened just within the last 24 hours.
Well, I think the United States has been trying to broker a different arrangement in the region that hopefully would get the Saudis and the Iranians to begin to deal with each other, to keep the Iranians away from a bomb and away from provocative military actions. Their missile test moves in the wrong direction. Killing Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr goes in the wrong direction. The State Department just essentially castigated the Saudi government for what it did, for doing something that made already bad tensions worse. So when you look at the behavior of both of these countries, it means that the tectonic tension between them is going to get dramatically worse now, and the way they'll manifest it is greater arms development, not only nuclear development, but at least ballistic missile development, and the Saudis may engage in their own course of actions in the same direction.
Not going in the direction a lot of folks wanted to. Steve Clemons, thank you so much on this Sunday. Angry protesters stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran overnight. You're seeing here some images from the Associated Press. Protesters throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails, setting fire to the building after Saudi Arabia executed a prominent Shiite cleric and 46 others yesterday. To our knowledge, no one was hurt or injured in those protests. The Iranian Students News Agency reported 40 arrests. Iran's supreme leader saying that Saudi Arabia will face divine vengeance. The executed sheikh was a critic of Saudi Arabia's treatment of its Shiite minority. Saudi Arabia is defending the execution as part of the war on terrorism. Here with more details, NBC's Ali Arouzi live in Tehran for us. Hey, Ali.
Hey, Richard, that's right. Angry protesters raided the Saudi embassy in Tehran last night over the execution of prominent Sheikh Nimr al-Nim. Protesters shouted death to Saudi Arabia through Molotov cocktails at the building before pouring inside and ransacking the premises. Flames and smokes could be seen billowing from the windows. Protesters last night also ransacked the Saudi consulate in Mashhad, a major city in the northeast of Iran. Iran's ruling establishment were very quick today to condemn the execution. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the highest authority in the land, said in a tweet that Saudi Arabia will face divine revenge for Nimr's execution, calling his execution a huge crime and a wrong deed. The country's very powerful Revolutionary Guard also vowed revenge on the House of Al Saud. Iran's President Rouhani, in a more balanced statement, said Nimr's execution violates human rights and Islamic values, but the damage to the Saudi embassy was by no means justifiable. Rouhani went on to say that he's ordered Iran's interior minister to identify the attackers and bring them to justice in order to put an end to these sort of crimes and guarantee the full safety of the country's diplomatic missions. Now, having said that, there's no love lost between rivals and foe, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and this latest episode is sure to fan the flames of tension between the two countries. There were more protests today in Tehran. They weren't allowed to gather outside the Saudi embassy. They gathered outside Palestine Square, a famous place where people get together to protest political things, and a few hundred protesters gathered there, burning the US flag, the Israeli flag, calling for death to America, Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia. A prominent cleric there addressed the crowd, saying that this was just the tip of the iceberg and that the Saudis are going to face a lot more from Iran. Back to you, Richard.
NBC's Ali Arouzi. Ali, thank you so much in Tehran. Bernie Sanders is a self-described democratic socialist, and a big tenet of his presidential campaign is going after the billionaire class. So you may find it more than just a bit surprising to find out which set of voters Bernie Sanders thinks may be up for grabs.
Many of Trump's supporters are working class people, and they are angry. And they're angry because they're working longer hours for lower wages. They're angry because their jobs have left this country and gone to China or other low-wage countries. They're angry because they can't afford to send their kids to college, or they can't retire with dignity.
Bernie Sanders is going after many of the same voters that Donald Trump is, even campaigning in some of the reddest parts of Iowa. And it also goes the other way, with the New York Times reporting that Donald Trump appeals to a certain kind of Democrat. Sanders and Trump may be about as far apart ideologically as any two candidates in the field, as has been said. But let's break out a Venn diagram for a second. If you map out both sides, both are trying to appeal to similar voters, Americans who are fed up with the political establishment. Middle-aged white men in the middle is the overlap, as well as fed up with the political establishment, as I just noted there. Let's bring back our panel right now. And who would have ever thought that they would be going after the same voters? Jane, I want to start with you, since you have written about this.
You know, on the trail, these candidates feel very similar. When you go to a Bernie Sanders rally or a Trump rally, you could be at either one. Of course, some of the rhetoric at a Donald Trump rally tends to be a little bit more inflammatory than a Bernie Sanders rally. But both of these candidates have struggled with minorities, because they are appealing often to people who talk about the economic structure. And that's not necessarily what, Black Lives Matter protesters have said, we need to be talking about at Bernie Sanders rallies. But both of them say the system is rigged. The big difference here is that Bernie says it's the banks who have rigged it, and Donald says that it's, bad leaders, bad deals, and not enough success. Basically, he says not enough Donald Trump.
We also have a map where we do lay out where that support is for the Donald Trump as well as the Bernie Sanders voters. You can see that the darker the red is from the New York Times here shows where that support is. It shows where Republicans are most likely to support Donald Trump, the darker areas there, where he has the most support, and then also the less affluent and less educated, and that's also part of that, evidently. So it kind of starts from the south, moves up the Appalachia and into New York City. Very interesting here, and tie that together, if you can, here, and when we look at this, Michael, what has just been said by Jane, and how they're going after the same voters, but it is also on just a certain part of the country.
It is a certain part of the country. It's areas where folks are more likely to respond to that sort of volume and red meat, and I call it red, although on the left you wouldn't call it red, we call it, I suppose, very blue meat. The irony is that Trump is painting himself as an anti-establishment candidate when his billions were made building subsidized developments here in New York City, and how he has managed to rewrite his own personal history to appeal to far-right, evangelical, anti-establishment, angry or anxious voters in Iowa. It just boggles the mind. It used to be you'd have to be a governor, right, to run for president in a year where people were anti-Washington because you didn't want to be a U.S. senator. Now, apparently, you have to be a builder from New York City or a socialist from Vermont. It's just... There's no rule book. We're in just completely uncharted territory.
Robert, as we look at Ross Perot as the previous, if you will, entrepreneur, billionaire that ran for president, it's exactly opposite geographically when you look at that New York Times map. Where Ross Perot was getting a lot of his support was west of the Mississippi. Right? And this is where Donald Trump's not getting any. Will Donald Trump be able to win over the Bernie Sanders supporters, whether they be either east or west of the Mississippi, based on, as was said here by Michael, it's totally different now. We can't look at the precedents.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little grassroots here. The Bernie Sanders supporter and the Donald Trump supporter, they're one and the same. They're the same type of a voter that is just frustrated.
Which Jane was saying, right?
Exactly, that is just frustrated with the establishment. Look, in the 70s, they were called the silent majority. In the 80s, they were called the Reagan Democrats. In the 90s, they were called the angry white male. It's the same type of a voter there. And what they're drawn to, and it goes back to my earlier point, they're drawn to some type of hope or some type of vision for the country, because what they feel as though is that their current elected establishment is not speaking to them.
They were drawn to Hillary Clinton in the last cycle.
They were. And it's funny because, and that's where you saw, if you remember, that's where you saw Barack Obama's numbers dip a little bit when he said privately at that San Francisco fundraiser, these are Americans that are clinging to guns and their religion. Those are real people out there that thus in the process feel like no one is speaking to them. Hillary Clinton can speak to that audience simply because she is a quote-unquote blue-collar Democrat, and her Democrat, her crosstabs really do speak to that demographic. The difference is that with the Donald Trump and with the Bernie Sanders, they are anti-establishment, although Bernie Sanders has been in the Congress since the 1980s.
I don't know that I agree that it was the same as the silent majority, because the silent majority was the establishment, and these are the folks that were anxious about people who are out there organizing and expressing themselves and stressed out by the civil rights movement and stressed out by the war and oppressions. And here it's the people who are loud and the people who are anxious.
So in the 1960s, there was the riots, and there was some other things that are going on, and there were a lot of people, particularly in Ohio and Kansas, Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and so forth, that Richard Nixon went in and spoke to in 1972. They voted for him in landslides. The exit polling showed exactly the same thing that we're saying today. I'm working harder for less. The American dream is becoming much more attainable to attain to, and thus in the process, I'm attracted to someone that's going to actually fix something.
In the middle of a brutal war in Vietnam, Nixon won overwhelmingly, and then Reagan won, what, 49 out of 50 states? It's
I don't know. What do you say?
I just don't see the analogy. I don't see an analogy between the Nixon years and the Reagan years and what we're seeing now. I think they're completely different demographics.
The voters that's not according to the facts.
I think what we are seeing now is that either way, whether it's silent majority or not, is that we're seeing that these candidates, Trump and Bernie Sanders, don't look like politicians.
That's exactly right.
I mean, Martin O'Malley has a lot of liberal credibility and has gotten nowhere because he looks and he walks and he talks like a politician. He is a, born and bred, looks great in that suit. He needs to be anything but. Bernie Sanders he's been in Congress, he's been in the political cycle, but he's an independent.
And it sounds like all three of you agree with that Venn diagram, though. The question is, which way will they go and who will be able to grab them?
But it does Bernie Sanders a disservice to compare him to Donald Trump, because one of them is.
I think Donald Trump might say the same thing.
Right, and you almost called him the Donald before in that, and you stopped yourself because they're just completely different people, and while they may be appealing to the same type of anxiety and voter, they're two very different people.
All right, we'll just take a quick break. Up next, a new bill in the Senate would recognize a Japanese internment camp as an official historic site. At its peak during the Second World War, Tule Lake Segregation Camp in Northern California incarcerated more than 18,000 Japanese Americans, growing into the largest of the 10 internment camps during the war. Senator Barbara Boxer, who introduced the bill, saying in a statement, quote, "This legislation will give Tule Lake the national recognition it deserves while honoring the tens of thousands of Japanese Americans who were forcibly relocated and incarcerated in one of our country's darkest moments." Here to discuss the bill, actor and activist George Takei. He and his family were held in an internment camp during the Second World War. He currently stars in the Broadway musical Allegiance, which is inspired by his own family's experience in the camps. George, thanks for being here with us today.
Good to be here, but with all respects, I'd like to correct what you said about the Japanese internment camps. They were American internment camps. We were not imprisoned by the Japanese. So I'd like to get that once and forever established. They were Japanese-American internment camps. And yes, the establishment of Tule Lake Camp as a national site managed by the National Park System is very important, because Tule Lake is probably the most significant of all of the 10 internment camps. It was also the largest internment camp, housing at its peak 18,000 people, but it was also selected to be the segregation center a year into internment because of a loyalty questionnaire.
Question 28.
Question 28. It was one sentence with two conflicting ideas. It asked, will you swear your loyalty to the United States of America and forswear your loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? This being asked of American citizens who were unjustly imprisoned for no reason other than that we looked like the people that bombed Pearl Harbor. There were no charges, no trial, no due process. And to ask American citizens to forswear our loyalty to the Emperor of Japan was insulting. We're Americans. But for the government to assume that was outrageous. So if you answered no, I have no loyalty to the Emperor to forswear, you were answering with the same no to the first part of the very same sentence, will you swear your loyalty to the United States? If you answered yes, meaning I do swear my loyalty to the United States, then you were confessing that you had been loyal to the Emperor of Japan.
And it would be perceived in the community that you're keeping your head low and allowing yourself and your community and the country really to be insulted in such a manner. And so those who said, no, I object to that, they were sent to Tule Lake.
And that was our family. My parents answered no to that and the other controversial question.
George, talk about that because of your experience in an internment camp at a very young age.
I was, by that time, 6 years old. I was 5 years old when we were first taken to Santa Anita Racetrack, the Assembly Center, and then from there we were taken to the swamps of southeastern Arkansas. And then a year into imprisonment, the loyalty questionnaire came down. And because my parents answered no on principle, my father said they took my business, they took our home, they took our freedom, but I will not give them my dignity. That's the one thing I will not give them.
When we think of your play that's running on Broadway, much loved and very well attended, how does that reflect your experience and why Tule Lake is so important as it's now being determined whether it will be, again, a historic site?
Well, it is, as I said, the largest, it was the largest internment camp. Today there is nothing there except for the concrete structure that was built by the internees called the stockade, where the particularly unruly ones were imprisoned. And it is important because it tells a story that's particularly timely for our times today. With a broad brush, painting all Muslims as potential terrorists. If you go to Arlington National Cemetery, some of the markers there have the Muslim symbol on them. Muslims have fought for this country. They have died for this country. And the message sent out by Allegiance is that that kind of thing in our history must never happen. And we tell that story 8 times a week, and we have a seat reserved in the theater for a Mr. Donald Trump.
Who you've invited.
He has a seat reserved for him, and we're counting the days that he's missing the performance.
If he were to show up and sit down in that seat, will you alter your play at all for him, or you will continue straight forward with what you've done now?
Well, the lesson he has to learn is a story that we are telling right now. It will not be altered. And I worked on his show, a Celebrity Apprentice.
That's right.
And I've had conversations with him privately on marriage equality. So we have a relationship established. And I hope that he comes and after he's seen Allegiance, that he'll come backstage and we'll have a very interesting discussion.
This was a very interesting discussion. George Takei, actor and activist, thank you so much for sharing your experience as well as the importance of Tule Lake as it now moves forward in the Senate. Thank you so much.